On the 23rd of May, 1878, William Ings arrived here at the docks in Southampton. The work he had come to do, with his unfailing commitment and determination and faith, was to be the unfaltering first steps of the commencement of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church in the British Isles. How was it for the early pioneers in starting an entirely new denomination?
One can imagine Ings walking through the dock area of Southampton with sailors having piled off a ship after being perhaps weeks or even months at sea.
There was also the whole idea of a foreign American preacher introducing new religious ideas to what was a very anglicized religious foundation. Naturally, Loughborough was very disappointed with these early efforts. The first Seventh-Day Adventist baptism finally took place in the British Isles on Sunday, the 8th of February, 1880.
This is a way that Loughborough is able to sort of lay the foundations for a truly British Adventist church in Britain.
We, the undersigned, hereby associate ourselves together as a church, taking the name Seventh-Day Adventist.
How did the Seventh-Day Adventist Church begin within these shores? And if there are challenges and struggles in winning converts today, then how was it for the early pioneers in starting an entirely new denomination? What were their challenges? What were their struggles? And what was the British reaction to the Adventist message? While the church was growing steadily in America, where it started, and even making inroads overseas in other countries such as Norway and Switzerland and Denmark, it was not until 1874 that the first Adventist arrived in the UK.
The first Adventist to visit is actually John N. Andrews in 1874 because his ship to Europe stops in England. So he is the first person to visit, and his visit to England, he says, we really do need to make some headway here at some point. Because even then, Andrews thinks big, and he can see now that we've sent missionaries to Europe, we're going to want to send them around the world, and the British Empire is vast. So if we can have a presence in Britain, it will open up for us India, Australia, New Zealand, parts of Africa. So even from Andrews' first visit in 1874, he is perceiving the need to open a mission in Britain. But then Andrews goes to Switzerland, and all his energies, all his efforts are taken up by just trying to get Adventism established on the continent of Europe.
The first appointed worker was William Ings. Ings was British born, but had emigrated as a child at 11 years of age with his family to America. And now, on his return, Ings was to settle in Southampton, primarily because he had relatives there. In the early pioneering days of the Adventist Church, the distribution of literature was the primary method of reaching out to people in previously unentered areas. In those days, the term colporteur was used to describe lay church members who distributed religious literature by hand to people on the street or by going door to door. Today, we would call them literature evangelists.
One can imagine Ings walking through the dock area of Southampton with sailors having piled off a ship after being perhaps weeks or even months at sea. They're wanting to get to a bar, a pub, celebrate. Maybe they're not wanting to receive a tract about the third angel's message. So it takes some nerve, it takes some guts, some gumption for Ings to do this. But again, he's going to where people are. He's not requiring them to come to him.
Through his work of distributing leaflets, Ings started the work preparing the ground. Seeing the tremendous task ahead and the potential for the work to move forward in England, his appeal for a full-time missionary was put forward to the General Conference, and it was agreed that they would send John N. Loughborough, who was a tall, bearded American leader who came with experience both as an evangelist and church administrator.
I think one of the reasons they choose Loughborough is because he is one of the most prominent church leaders. He was a very successful evangelist and preacher. He had won hundreds, perhaps thousands of converts, even by the late 1870s, with his very successful evangelistic campaigns in the Midwest of the United States and on the West Coast. He would pitch a big tent, he would print handbills, and then he would print these extraordinary sermons, and he really built up the church in parts of the Midwest and especially in California. So this was a very talented man, a very capable man, a man who was perceived as being able to go outside his comfort zone, someone who had experience of pioneering the work in a new territory. And so I think we can see how church leaders may well have felt that Loughborough was indeed an obvious man to send to Great Britain.
With these credentials behind him, Loughborough came to England in the hope of achieving similar results. John Loughborough and his wife arrived in Southampton on December the 30th, 1878, and settled in the Shirley area of Southampton. Within just a week of arriving, Loughborough hired the Shirley Hall, and over the next few weeks held meetings where he delivered lectures in the evenings. But nightly attendance was so low that he was forced to abandon hiring Shirley Hall due to expenses. But Loughborough didn't give up. Instead, he continued meetings in the basement of his own home at Stanley Cottage. Whilst in Southampton, I visited the Central Library to look for records of Ings and Loughborough.
It says that he's active in Shirley Road in 1880.
We were able to find the Southampton directory that dates back to 1880, and we have an entry here for J.N. Loughborough, evangelist, Ravenswood, Shirley Road. So that's quite interesting to know that he was numbered as a resident here in Southampton. Not only was he mentioned, but William Ings as well, and it mentions him as being a colporteur, which is quite interesting because I'm sure that would have been an unusual term during the 1880s for an occupation, but it mentions him as a colporteur working in the community here in Southampton, in the Shirley area of Southampton. By the spring of 1879, just 4 months after his arrival, Loughborough decided to do what had brought him great success in America in reaching masses of people. Loughborough purchased a large tent, about 65 feet in diameter at a cost of £85, and he conducted the first tent evangelistic campaign on a site at the corner of Waterloo and Shirley Road in Southampton. So this is the Weekly Hampshire Independent, and it dates from May 17, 1879. This is the time when John Loughborough would have done his first tent evangelistic campaign in Southampton, and he has an entry here that says tent meetings, biblical addresses will be delivered in the tent, Shirley Road opposite Waterloo Road, and it mentions him, John J.N. Loughborough, American evangelist, every Sunday at 3:30 and 7 p.m. and on Monday, Wednesday, and Friday evenings at 8 p.m. And then it mentions a little bit more about the details. It says seats are free and all are invited to attend. So this is quite interesting to see that John Loughborough uses the local newspaper to try to advertise far and wide. Hampshire not only encompassed Southampton, but the whole of south of England as it was then. So it was an advert that really reached a great number of people. The opening meeting was held on the 18th of May with approximately 600 people in attendance. For these meetings, Loughborough was assisted by another Bible worker, Maud Sisley. Like Ings, Sisley was British born, having emigrated to the States with her family as a child. And she was committed and a determined young woman who became the first female missionary to Europe. For 3 months, meetings were held nearly every day, and after a promising start, attendance began to drop, partly due to poor, wet, and windy weather conditions. There was also the whole idea of a foreign American preacher introducing new religious ideas to what was a very anglicized religious foundation. In addition, tent meetings proved unappealing to the English aristocratic upper classes. During the entire year of 1879, there were a total of 255 meetings held at the tent campaign and at those at Loughborough's own house. However, during this whole time, not a single person was baptized. Naturally, Loughborough was very disappointed with these early efforts.
It's not hindsight to say he should have done things differently, because when he travels there, Andrews actually writes him a letter. And Andrews had visited Britain a couple of times since that first transit on the way to Switzerland in 1874. And Andrews writes to him and says, you know, Brother Loughborough, you may need to do things a little differently here, because European culture is different.
Loughborough's experience in America had been that people of all social classes would come to his evangelistic tent meetings. And because of his success, Loughborough felt certain that his methods would be just as successful. However, he hadn't accounted for the differences between the British and the American cultures.
In Victorian Britain, a very class-conscious society, a tent was something associated with the circus, with the carnival, with lower class things. So middle class people would never go to a tent.
Despite there being no baptisms, 30 people had covenanted to keep the Sabbath. So these early efforts had not been entirely wasted. After the slow start, Loughborough and his small team rented a large house at 252 Shirley Road in Southampton for an annual rent of £40. The cottage, known as Ravenswood, included a large meeting room that could seat 200 people and approximately 15 other rooms which were used for accommodation areas for the workers. Well, I'm here at the Adventist Institution, Newbold College of Higher Education, to talk to Linda Baildam, the librarian here, to look at some of the archives and documents and photos that date back to the early pioneers who came here to start the church in the British Isles.
There's a lot of the original pictures that we have been donated to us over the years, and we really rely on that, and we always love it if they come with names and dates.
So if you just go back to this picture then, so this is Ravenswood as we know it. You've
got Ings.
People, so there's William there. Mm-hmm. You've got his wife there. You've got John Loughborough there. And they're all looking quite stoic, aren't they? Just posing outside Ravenswood.
Yes.
Resolute in the work moving forward, Loughborough persevered in his efforts, and on January the 11th, 1880, a National Tract and Missionary Society was organised. Its 36 members would distribute various copies of the Signs of the Times magazine by hand and by mail to those interested. Copies were also left in libraries and handed to people on the streets.
The Tract Society is important because this is a way that Loughborough is able to sort of lay the foundations for a truly British Adventist church in Britain.
The influx of voluntary workers joining the Tract Society was just what Loughborough needed to help with his efforts, and the impact proved effective. A month after the Tract Society was formed, and just over 1 year since John Loughborough's arrival, that the first Seventh-Day Adventist baptism finally took place in the British Isles on Sunday, the 8th of February, 1880. 6 people were immersed in the baptistry by John Loughborough in one of the lower rooms in Ravenswood, and by the end of the week, 7 more were baptized, bringing the first official membership of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church in England to 13. Back at Newbold College, Linda has found the original archive that documents when the first church members were formally organised as the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
So this is really quite significant. We, the undersigned, hereby associate ourselves together as a church, taking the name Seventh-day Adventist, covenanting to keep the commandments of God and the faith of Jesus Christ. And the first name that you see on there is
J.N. Loughborough. It seemed that the main methods of evangelism used by John Loughborough and his small team were public meetings held in either a tent setting or in hiring public halls, and tract distribution. And when he considered the vast territory that was to be covered, the main problems that they faced was lack of workforce and financial support. So in November 1881, John Loughborough went back to America, and at the General Conference session held at Battle Creek, he appealed for more workers and financial support for the work in Britain. His appeal was partially granted, and on his return to England 3 months later, he was accompanied by 3 more workers, 2 laymen and 1 ordained minister called Albert John, who was a young and enthusiastic preacher who went to work in the northern English town of Grimsby.
Adventists start to found what they call city missions. The first 2 are in Chicago and New York, and they spread around North America. But then church leaders say we need these in Europe and other parts of the world as well. And they like to locate them in ports, because a port gives you access not only to the people who live there, but all the people who pass through. Later they set one up in Hamburg and other ports in Scandinavia, but the first 2 city missions in Europe are Southampton and Grimsby.
Albert John started his endeavours in Grimsby by doing similar tent meetings and leaflet distribution. Like Loughborough, he too was met with scepticism and high rising costs of hiring halls, so he decided to do something different. He began to hold open-air meetings in the town marketplace. This had been a popular method by other denominations, and Albert John conducted these open-air meetings in Alsaby as well as in Grimsby. Such was the positive publicity for the Seventh-Day Adventist Church that following these debates, 12 people joined the Seventh-Day Adventist Church, which led to a second organized church being established in Grimsby on Heneage Road in July 1884. A month later, Ellen G. White traveled to England to visit and encourage this group of believers, and she was to return again 3 years later. Ellen White came back to Alsaby and preached in the Foresters' Hall not too far from here, and as a result of her meetings, a group of believers became Adventists, and as a result of their faith and determination, they were given this plot of land where they were able to build the first Seventh-day Adventist Church. The Alsaby Church, with seating for 100 people, became the first church built and owned by the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Ben Hooson is a lifelong member of the Hull and Alsaby churches.
There's sufficient success of those meetings that the church could be built, and in 1887 I think the records show that the church did commence its building programme, which took a year, and the date stone on the gable of the church is 1888.
And so, through tough, hard work, commitment, and determination, the Seventh-day Adventist Church in England had now 3 organised churches in Southampton, in Grimsby, and Alsaby. So here in Grimsby, we knew that this was a famous site for the church, and Heneage Road, which we're on now, would have been the site where the first headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was, and also a printing press. And we didn't know exactly where that place was, but as we were driving down this road, we stumbled across this building. We've compared pictures dating back to the early 20th century, and we can see the similarities of this building with what we've seen, and we've discovered that indeed this building here is the first building of the British Union Conference. From this building in Grimsby, the work was spearheaded by trained lay members who formed a band of colporteurs distributing literature which composed of the Signs of the Times and the first British magazine called Present Truth.
Loughborough realizes we need a British Adventist paper, and so he creates Present Truth. Many of the articles will actually be taken from the Signs of the Times back in the States, but they also write fresh articles, and Loughborough writes for it himself continually.
Adventism saw early success in cities such as Nottingham, Kettering and Bath, where up to 80 people joined the church, most of whom acknowledged that their initial interest had been aroused by reading copies of the present truth.
It's interesting how literature had played such a huge part in the development.
Back amongst the archives at Newbold College, and Linda has found documents that highlights the use of literature evangelism in Bath.
At Bath in 1886, George Stagg began to solicit subscriptions from door to door. This method paved the way for the mass distribution of the magazine on a full or part-time basis. Soon readers were invited to attend public services held by Seventh-Day Adventist evangelists. This was successfully achieved at Bath and opened the way for J.S. Washburn to begin services there at the end of 1891.
And so, slowly but surely, the work began to find momentum. And with John Loughborough returning to America, other missionaries and workers came from across the Atlantic to help steer the work of the church. Colporteurs also spearheaded the work in Ireland, and the real beginning of the Seventh-Day Adventist Church in Ireland began in 1889 when William Hutchinson raised up a group of 20 in Banbridge, including 6 members of the Bell family, some of whom became excellent canvassers around Ireland.
Now we have here, again, really old. This is the Seventh-day Adventist Church of Banbridge. This is the front page of the church record book, and it's really handy if it has the name of the church and when it was organised.
Yeah.
You can see 1891.
The church steadily grew, and you have baptisms taking place on a regular basis.
You can see the names on this first page. Well, you have 21 just on the first page who were baptised July the 4th, 1891.
NZ Town, working with colporteurs, saw the result of their labours when the first Scottish company was organised in Glasgow. However, it was not until 1903 that the work in Scotland officially started, where a church of 37 members was organised. Well, we know him as NZ Town.
Interestingly enough, he came as a pioneer colporteur to Scotland, and he worked for 4 years in Great Britain, leading out in canvassing. And when I was reading a little bit about him, actually this is in his obituary, it said that up until the age of 22, his time was spent working on the home farm and going to school. And it was through his reading of Signs of the Times and other literature lent to him by a neighbour that he himself was converted.
Right. Okay.
So I think there's probably nothing more powerful than using something that really convicted you, sharing that, and then becoming quite an expert in doing that to gather other people.
Absolutely. The work in Wales also expanded through the work of colporteurs, and the first baptism took place in 1897 as a result of a campaign by Judson Washburn. Within 3 years, 3 churches were established in the areas of Cardiff, Newport and Pontypridd. The work having gained a foothold in Southampton, Lincolnshire, Bath, the Midlands, Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. The biggest challenge of all was to start the work in London. Stephen Haskell, an American leader with great administrative and evangelistic skills, when he took over the leadership of the British Church, he grasped 2 important factors. The first was to establish the headquarters of the Seventh-day Adventist Church in London, and secondly, to train British workers to take the lead in evangelistic efforts.
It's the largest city in Europe, talking about millions of people. How do we even get a footing? But it is interesting that Adventists are slow to work in London. But by the end of the 1880s, the church has a base in London. The publishing house is based there. There's a community of American missionaries there. But it is striking that we're never as far advanced in London as we were, say, in Grimsby or Southampton. That only comes much later.
If we move on to the present truth in this bound edition, now you'll see that instead of where it said before Great Grimsby, now it's saying London. And the year now is 1896. So the publishing work now has moved to as you can see here, 451 Holloway Road.
Excellent. After Haskell moved the printing press and the headquarters from Grimsby to the rented premises at 451 Holloway Road in North London, he made a start with 3 trained female Bible instructors and rented a large home in Tufnell Park. The house known as Chalmers was the house where the early pioneers and colporteurs would have taken residence, and it was here that the first baptism in London took place. The baptisms took place in June 1888 in a tank constructed in the garden, where between 20 and 30 are said to have been immersed. By the following year, there were 65 members, where previously there were none, and the first church was organised in North London. The success in London soon began to permeate throughout Great Britain. Taking the advice given by Ellen White, evangelists began using large-scale advertising and hiring prestigious halls and preaching geared toward the audience, and this became more effective. A campaign by Judson Washburn that saw the work return to Southampton resulted in the local church increasing to 120, and they purchased a local church on Shirley Road, which still exists today. So here in the Southampton Church, which is the first church that was established in the British Isles, the present Southampton Church has done well to keep a number of original archives and documents that date back to the 1880s. So we have a copy of the deeds that was signed that actually established the first Seventh-Day Adventist Church here in Southampton. We have a folder with original letters and some interesting pictures as well of perhaps the early church as it was. And what's also interesting is the Southampton have done very well to keep the minutes of their church members that goes back a number of years. And what I see here is a copy of the original membership of Southampton Church. And the first 2 names on that list is J.N. Loughborough and his wife, Anne Loughborough. Arthur Jonas is a member and elder of today's Southampton Church.
It's quite amazing, really, when we think about it, that here we are on a plot of land in a building that our first pioneers came to. Shirley Road, this was the home of Adventism. And for us, it gives us quite a sense of pride, I think, really. Especially as a young person coming down here all those years ago, not knowing, and then finding this out, thinking, wow, even Ellen White walked down this road to go and stay with the Loughboroughs. And here we are at a church where John Loughborough, William Ings, they started this place going.
The British Church was taken over by William Warren Prescott, and during his term in office, the membership continued to grow, and a college as well as several health institutions were established. But Prescott's first duty was the formation of the British Union Conference of Seventh-Day Adventists in 1898. The membership stood at 590. There were 15 churches, 6 companies, 5 ministers, and 6 licensed ministers. So what are we to make of the first 25 years of Seventh-day Adventism in the British Isles? Undoubtedly, the work began slowly. There were limitations, both in financial support as well as the workforce. However, because of their determination and their commitment and tenacity to drive the work forward, their perseverance paid off, and a solid foundation was established in the British Isles.